Jack was a 26-year-old park ranger who had just begun his career in a vast national park, a place where nature thrived, and wildlife roamed freely. Ever since he was a child, he had been fascinated by animals, spending hours reading about them and dreaming of a future where he could protect and care for them. Now, with his dream finally realized, every morning he woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, eager to patrol the park's vast landscapes, ensure the safety of its inhabitants, and immerse himself in the wonders of the wild. His love for the job was evident in the way he carried himself, with eyes always scanning the horizon, ears tuned to the subtle sounds of nature, and a deep respect for the creatures that called the park home. The national park where Jack worked was renowned for its diverse ecosystem, but it was especially famous for its African lions. The park had a population of around 30 lions, and Jack felt an immense responsibility to look after their well-being. He had read every study and report about them, learning their behaviors, territories, and hunting patterns. There was something awe-inspiring about them, their raw power mixed with their social bonds, their unspoken rules within the pride, and their role as apex predators in the ecosystem. Jack understood that even though these animals were wild and untamed, they were also incredibly intelligent, capable of deep connections with their surroundings and even, on rare occasions, with humans. One crisp morning, as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the sky, painting it in gentle hues of pink and orange, Jack prepared for his routine patrol. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the scent of blooming plants, damp earth, and the distant rustling of trees swaying in the breeze. He climbed into his jeep, feeling the familiar hum of the engine beneath him as he set off on the winding dirt roads that snaked through the park. The land was alive with movement, herds of antelope grazing in the golden light, birds soaring overhead, their calls echoing in the distance, and somewhere, hidden within the landscape, the lions, resting after a night of hunting. Jack's route that morning took him through a particularly rocky area, a region known as a prime habitat for one of the lion prides. The towering rock formations provided perfect shelter, shaded resting spots, and excellent vantage points for hunting. He had passed through this area many times before, but each time, he felt a quiet reverence for the sheer beauty of the place. The rugged cliffs, worn by time, stood as silent witnesses to the lives of the creatures that had roamed here for generations. It was a place of power, of survival, of nature at its most primal. As he rounded a bend in the road, something caught his eye, a group of young lions near the edge of a steep cliff. He slowed the jeep, watching as the cubs tumbled over one another in play, their carefree movements a stark contrast to the dangerous drop just feet away. A small smile played on his lips as he observed their youthful energy, but a feeling of unease crept into his chest. He knew this area well, knew the risks that came with it. The rocks were not as solid as they seemed, and for young, inexperienced lions, the consequences of one wrong step could be disastrous. Jack kept his eyes locked on the playful young lions, their carefree movements a stark contrast to the perilous edge of the cliff they were dangerously close to. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, highlighting the contrast between the safety of the solid ground and the sheer drop that awaited below. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as a sense of unease settled in his chest. He had seen these cubs before, watched them grow under the protection of their pride, but they were still young, still inexperienced, still unaware of the very real dangers that lurked in their environment. He scanned the area, hoping to see one of the older lions keeping watch, someone who could call them away from the danger, but the adults were resting further back, their golden coats blending into the landscape as they lay in the shade. His pulse quickened. He knew that lions were intelligent, but cubs, much like human children, could be reckless, too absorbed in their games to recognize danger until it was too late. As he debated whether to intervene, a sudden shift in the rocks caught his attention. A section of the cliffside, right where the cubs were playing, looked unstable, and as one of the young lions pounced onto it, Jack saw the ground beneath its paws crumble ever so slightly. His heart pounded. It was only a matter of time before disaster struck. He silently willed the cubs to move away, for the pride's leader to sense the danger and guide them to safety, but they remained oblivious, their playful roars filling the air as they swatted at one another. Then, finally, an older lion, a massive male with a thick mane, stirred. Jack could almost see the moment the big cat noticed the crumbling rocks. The lion rose, powerful muscles rippling beneath his tawny coat as he let out a deep, commanding roar. It was a warning, an urgent call for the cubs to retreat. But they didn't. Engrossed in their game, they ignored the sound, too focused on their playful wrestling to recognize the authority in the older lion's voice. Jack's stomach tightened as he watched the male step forward, his patience wearing thin. With a second, even louder roar, he advanced toward the cubs, his movements no longer just a warning but an outright demand. This time, the cubs responded, their ears flicking back as they hesitated. One by one, they began backing away, but it was already too late. The combined weight of the adult lion's approach and the movement of the cubs was the final push the fragile cliffside needed. Jack barely had time to register what was happening before a loud crack shattered the morning stillness, and a large portion of the rock face gave way. Everything seemed to slow. One of the cubs let out a startled yelp as the ground beneath it disappeared, its claws scrambling for purchase on the loose dirt. Jack watched in horror as the young lion tumbled toward the abyss. At the last possible second, the cub managed to dig its claws into a jagged outcrop of rock jutting out from the cliffside. It dangled there, its small body trembling, its hind legs kicking helplessly against the empty air below. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The cub was alive, but it wouldn't be able to hold on for long. The rock was too smooth, too steep, and with every second that passed, its grip would weaken. If it let go, there would be no saving it. Jack knew he had to act. Now. Jack's heart pounded as he threw open the door of his jeep, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he sprinted toward the cliff's edge. His mind raced through the possibilities. How much time did the cub have before its grip gave out? Could he reach it? Would it panic and fall before he had the chance? He grabbed the radio strapped to his belt, his fingers fumbling slightly in his urgency. This is Jack, emergency at Sector 3. A lion cub has fallen off the cliff, it's clinging to a ledge, but it won't hold for long. I need immediate backup. The radio crackled with a response, but he barely heard it, his focus locked on the terrified cub below. It let out a desperate cry, its claws struggling to maintain a hold on the slick rock. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before it slipped. There was no time to wait for help. He needed to act now. Thinking fast, Jack spun back toward his jeep, yanked open the trunk, and grabbed a coil of heavy-duty rope. His hands worked quickly, unrolling the length and securing one end around a thick, sturdy tree root near the cliff's edge. He gave it a hard tug, testing its strength, before looping the other end around himself, knotting it tightly across his chest. Every second that passed sent a fresh surge of urgency through his veins, but he forced himself to stay steady. He had done rope rescues before, never for a lion, but the principle remained the same. Breathe. Focus. Move with purpose. Just as he was about to lower himself over the edge, he heard the distant roar of approaching jeeps. Backup was here. He turned his head just long enough to see several rangers jumping out of their vehicles, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding as they spotted the dangling cub. "We'll secure the rope," one of them shouted, rushing forward to reinforce the knot. Another ranger grabbed a second rope and prepared a backup line. They were working fast, but Jack knew there was no time to waste. Gripping the rope tightly, he swung his legs over the cliff's edge and began his descent. The drop below was dizzying, but he forced himself to ignore it, focusing only on the cub's trembling form a few feet below. The ledge it clung to was small, too small. Its back legs dangled over open air, kicking uselessly as it tried to find purchase. Jack's boots scraped against the rock face as he lowered himself inch by inch, feeling the strain in his arms and legs. Finally, he was close enough to reach out. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. The cub's wide, golden eyes locked onto him, filled with fear but not aggression. It was exhausted, its small muscles quivering with the effort of holding on. Jack knew he had one shot at this. Moving as carefully as possible, he looped the rope around the cub's midsection, pulling it snug. For a second, the cub flinched, its grip faltering, but Jack tightened his hold. "Hold on, we've got you." With a quick tug on the rope, he signaled to the rangers above. "Pull us up." The moment the line went taut, the cub let out a soft whimper, its claws finally slipping free, but it didn't fall. The rope held. The rangers above pulled with everything they had, the tension vibrating through the line as they hoisted Jack and the cub up, inch by inch. Every muscle in Jack's body burned with effort, but he held on, his grip firm, his focus unwavering. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack reached the top. Hands grabbed at him, pulling him and the cub onto solid ground. The moment they were safe, Jack collapsed onto his back, breathing hard. The cub lay beside him, its chest rising and falling rapidly. Then, slowly, it lifted its head and met his gaze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then, in a moment that sent a shiver down Jack's spine, the cub let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, not a whimper, but something softer. A sound that almost felt like gratitude. Jack lay on the ground, his chest rising and falling as he tried to catch his breath. The rescue had been physically exhausting, but the rush of adrenaline still pumped through his veins, keeping him alert. Beside him, the young lion cub trembled, its small body heaving with exertion. The other rangers stood back, giving both man and beast space to recover. No one spoke, as if afraid to disturb the delicate moment unfolding before them. Jack slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows, his gaze locking onto the cub's. Its golden eyes were wide, filled with something he couldn't quite describe, not fear, not aggression, but something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. A silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. Carefully, Jack reached forward, his fingers brushing against the rough rope still secured around the cub's midsection. The lion didn't flinch. It didn't try to pull away. It just watched him, its breathing steadying as if it somehow knew he meant no harm. Gently, Jack loosened the knots, his movements slow and deliberate. The last thing he wanted was to startle it now, not after everything they had been through. The moment the final loop slipped free, the cub stretched its limbs, testing its movement as if realizing it was no longer bound. It stood shakily, its legs still unsteady beneath it, but it didn't run. It simply remained there, watching Jack with quiet intensity. The rest of the pride had gathered in the distance, their massive forms silhouetted against the rocky terrain. The older lions had returned, their keen eyes fixed on the cub. Jack knew they were waiting, hesitant but aware of what had just taken place. He exhaled slowly, shifting back to give the young lion space, expecting it to bolt toward its family. But instead, the cub took one last lingering look at him. Then, in an act that sent a shiver down his spine, it let out a soft, low rumble. It wasn't a growl, nor was it a whimper. It was something else, something deep, something ancient, something Jack could only interpret as gratitude. And then, just like that, the cub turned and walked away. The pride parted as it rejoined them, their powerful bodies moving in perfect, fluid grace. The older lions sniffed at the cub, ensuring it was unharmed, before they all melted back into the landscape, disappearing beyond the rocks. Jack remained where he was, watching them until they were gone, his mind still trying to process everything that had just happened. The bond that had formed between him and that young lion was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. It was something he couldn't explain, something that defied logic, but he knew, deep in his bones, that he would never forget it. One of the rangers finally broke the silence. "I've never seen anything like that before," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. Jack let out a small, breathless chuckle. "Me neither," he admitted. But somehow, he had a feeling this wasn't the last time he would see that lion. As the days turned into weeks, life in the park gradually returned to normal. Jack resumed his routine patrols, watching over the land and its inhabitants, but he often found his thoughts drifting back to the young lion he had saved. He knew the wild was unpredictable, that animals didn't form attachments the way humans did, and yet, something about that rescue lingered in his mind. He hadn't seen the cub since that day, but every time he passed the rocky outcrop where the pride lived, he found himself scanning the landscape, searching for a familiar golden coat among the brush. The memory of the cub's soft, rumbling sound, its strange, almost human-like expression of gratitude, stayed with him, haunting him in the quiet moments of his patrols. Months passed, and soon the monsoon season arrived. The once dry plains transformed under heavy rainfall, the earth turning soft and treacherous. The rivers swelled, and landslides became a constant threat, making this time of year one of the most dangerous for both animals and rangers alike. Jack knew the risks, but patrolling during the rains was necessary. Animals often found themselves in distress, trapped by rising waters or caught in unstable terrain. One morning, under the relentless downpour, Jack set out on his patrol, the windshield wipers of his Jeep working overtime to push back the sheets of rain. Visibility was poor, the sky a dark, unbroken gray, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and storm-soaked grass. As he maneuvered carefully along the muddy trail, he spotted something ahead, a massive tree that had been uprooted, its thick trunk sprawled across the road. With a sigh, he pulled over, stepping out into the rain and pulling the hood of his jacket over his head. He approached the fallen tree, running a hand over the slick, wet bark, his thoughts momentarily drifting to the small creatures that had likely lost their home because of its collapse. It was in that moment, lost in his thoughts, that he heard it, a deep, distant rumble that sent ice down his spine. At first, he thought it was thunder, just another roll of the storm passing overhead, but then he felt it. The ground trembled beneath his feet. He turned, his stomach twisting as he saw it, an enormous wall of mud and debris rushing toward him, the force of nature unleashed in a terrifying, unstoppable wave. He barely had time to react. His first instinct was to run back to the Jeep, but even as he turned, he knew he wouldn't make it. The landslide was too fast, too powerful. His only chance was the fallen tree. Heart pounding, he lunged toward it, scrambling up its wet trunk, gripping the rough bark with desperate hands as the roaring flood of earth and rock crashed down around him. The impact was violent, the world around him spinning as the force of the slide knocked the air from his lungs. Then everything went dark. Jack's world was swallowed by darkness. The force of the landslide had knocked him off balance, and before he could react, the torrent of mud and debris had consumed him. The weight was suffocating, pressing against his chest, trapping his arms, locking his legs in place. He tried to move, but it was useless. The dense, wet earth held him like a vice, pinning him beneath layers of thick, unrelenting mud. His breaths came in short gasps, panic clawing at his mind as he struggled to stay calm. He knew panicking would only burn through his limited air supply, but it was difficult to suppress the rising fear. Was this how it was going to end? Buried alive beneath the very land he had dedicated his life to protecting? He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to control his breathing, listening to the muffled sounds of rain still pounding above him. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he could hear the rumble of thunder, or maybe it was just the last echoes of the landslide settling around him. Time became meaningless in the darkness. Minutes felt like hours, and with each passing second, his hope dwindled. His radio was useless, buried along with him, and his body was too tightly packed to even attempt digging himself out. He had no way of knowing if anyone had seen what happened. His colleagues were miles away, scattered across the park on their own patrols, unaware that he was trapped beneath the earth. He tried to focus, to keep himself from slipping into panic, but his breaths were growing shallower, his strength fading. Just when the weight of hopelessness threatened to take over, he heard something. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling above him, barely audible over the relentless downpour. He strained his ears, focusing through the layers of mud and debris. It was rhythmic, deliberate, something moving. Not the chaotic shifting of the landslide, not the sound of rain, but something alive, something digging. Then, a deep, resonant sound cut through the damp, suffocating silence, a roar. Jack's breath hitched. It wasn't human. It wasn't the voice of his fellow rangers calling out for him. It was a lion. His heart pounded as realization dawned. The sound was unmistakable, powerful, commanding. It wasn't a call of aggression, nor was it a warning. It was something else entirely. His mind raced, unable to believe what his instincts were telling him. Could it really be? Could it be the same lion cub he had saved all those months ago? The thought was almost impossible, too unreal to accept, and yet, the sound above him continued. Heavy paws shifted over the mud, something large moving with purpose, scraping at the earth. The digging grew more intense, more desperate, as if whatever was above him knew exactly where he was. Jack's chest tightened, not from fear but from something deeper, something inexplicable. He wasn't alone. Something, or someone, had found him. Jack lay still, barely daring to breathe as the realization settled in. Something was digging above him, heavy paws scraping at the layers of mud and debris pinning him down. The rhythmic movements weren't random, they were purposeful, determined, as if whatever was up there knew exactly where to dig. Another deep, guttural roar rumbled through the earth above him, vibrating in his chest. It was closer now. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears, his mind torn between disbelief and desperate hope. Was it truly the same lion, the one he had saved months ago? The thought was almost impossible to comprehend, yet the evidence was undeniable. What were the chances that any wild animal, let alone a lion, would react this way? Could it really remember him, recognize him, and now, against all odds, be trying to return the favor? His lungs burned as he struggled to draw in more air through the small pocket that had kept him alive. He tried to move again, to shift his arms, his legs, anything, but the weight of the mud was suffocating. Just when he thought he might pass out from exhaustion, Another sound broke through the storm, the sharp, unmistakable voices of human rescuers. His rangers. Hope flared in his chest. Somehow, they had found him. But how? Then he knew. The lion. Its unusual behavior must have drawn them here. The very animal he had risked his life to save had led them straight to him. Jack tried to call out, but his voice was weak, barely more than a rasp. He forced himself to focus, to push past the exhaustion. He couldn't give up now, not when help was this close. The scraping above intensified, faster, more frantic, as if the lion sensed he was fading. Moments later, a shaft of light cut through the darkness. He blinked against the sudden brightness, the first real sign that he was going to make it out of this alive. Then, strong hands reached down, grabbing at the mud, pulling chunks of earth away, clearing a path to free him. The moment fresh air hit his face, he gasped, his lungs burning as he drew in deep, desperate breaths. The rangers worked quickly, lifting him out of the pit with careful but urgent movements. Jack felt his body go weightless for a brief second before being pulled onto solid ground. He collapsed onto his back, the cold rain pelting his face, his heart still pounding in his chest. As his blurred vision adjusted, he saw them, his fellow rangers standing around him, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief. But beyond them, just a few feet away, stood the lion. It was drenched, its golden fur darkened by mud and rain, but it was unmistakably the same animal. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, the lion let out a low, quiet sound, not a roar, not a growl, something softer, something Jack could only describe as acknowledgement. Then, as silently as it had come, it turned and disappeared into the wilderness. Jack lay on the soaked earth, his body aching, his breath still uneven, but his mind was consumed by only one thought: the lion. The same cub he had pulled from the cliff's edge months ago had just returned the favor, digging through the mud, leading the rangers to him, saving his life in a way that defied logic, that shattered everything he thought he knew about the wild. He turned his head, watching as the lion disappeared into the storm, its powerful form blending into the rain-soaked landscape. For a long moment, no one spoke. The rangers, still catching their breath, exchanged looks of astonishment, their eyes flickering between Jack and the retreating lion as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. One of them finally broke the silence, his voice laced with disbelief. "Did that lion just save you?" Jack exhaled slowly, still staring at the spot where the animal had vanished. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think it did." The rescue team helped him to his feet, steadying him as he found his balance. His legs felt weak, his muscles sore from being trapped for so long, but there was no time to dwell on his discomfort. He was alive. That was all that mattered. As they made their way back to the jeep, the storm still raging around them, Jack couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of awe pressing against his ribs. Wild animals weren't supposed to act this way. Instinct, survival, fear, those were the rules that dictated their world. But something had happened between him and that lion. Some unspoken connection had formed in that moment on the cliffside, something neither of them had forgotten. And now, against all odds, it had repaid his kindness. By the time they reached the ranger station, word of the incredible event had already begun to spread. Jack was examined for injuries, but aside from exhaustion and a few bruises, he was remarkably unscathed. His fellow rangers pressed him for details, their voices filled with a mix of skepticism and amazement. "Are you telling us a lion tracked you down?" In a storm, one of them asked, shaking his head as if the very idea was impossible. Jack could only shrug. "I don't know how," he admitted, running a hand through his damp hair. But it did. The story spread beyond the station, reaching the park staff, the researchers, even the local news. People debated whether it was pure coincidence or something more, but Jack didn't care what they believed. He had seen it with his own eyes, felt it in his bones. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't random. That lion had known. Days passed, and though the storm eventually cleared, the encounter with the lion never faded from Jack's mind. Every time he patrolled the park, he found himself glancing toward the rocky cliffs where the pride roamed, wondering if he would see it again. He didn't expect to. After all, the wild had its own way of moving forward. But one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in deep shades of amber and gold, he spotted a familiar figure in the distance. The lion stood at the edge of the tall grass, watching him. Their eyes met across the vast stretch of land, and Jack felt that same quiet understanding pass between them. He didn't move. Neither did the lion. Then, after a few lingering seconds, it turned and disappeared into the night. Jack smiled to himself, his heart pounding, knowing that, in some way, their story wasn't over yet. Jack continued his work as a ranger, but something had shifted within him. Every day, as he patrolled the park, the memory of the lion lingered in his mind like an unspoken truth, something rare and profound that no one else could fully understand. The wild had its own laws, its own balance, yet somehow, he and that lion had defied them, creating a bond that neither of them had intended yet neither could deny. He didn't expect to see it again, but deep down, he knew it was out there, somewhere in the vast expanse of the park, watching, living, surviving just as he was. And so, life moved on. The storm season passed, the rivers calmed, and the golden grasses returned to their full height, swaying under the warmth of the sun. The lions continued their reign over the land, hunting under the moon, resting in the shade of the trees, and roaring into the night. Jack often spotted the pride from a distance, their sleek forms blending seamlessly into the terrain, but he never approached. He respected their world, just as they, in their own way, respected his. But then, something extraordinary happened. One morning, as Jack was making his rounds, he saw a figure in the distance, a lion standing alone on the ridge of a hill, its silhouette framed by the soft glow of dawn. His breath caught in his throat. It was the same lion. He knew it instantly, recognizing its form, the quiet strength in its stance. It stood there for a long moment, unmoving, staring directly at him. Jack remained still, waiting, heart pounding as he wondered what it meant, why it had come. Then, to his astonishment, the lion began to move, not away, not back toward the pride, but toward him. Slowly, carefully, its powerful muscles shifting beneath its golden fur, it approached, closing the distance between them. Jack didn't reach for his radio. He didn't move at all. He just watched, frozen in place, as the lion stopped mere feet away, its massive paws pressing into the earth, its breath visible in the cool morning air. Their eyes met once again, and in that moment, Jack understood. This wasn't just an animal passing by, wasn't just some chance encounter. This was something deliberate, something rare. The lion had sought him out. A deep, low rumble emerged from the lion's throat, not a growl, not a warning, but something familiar, something Jack had heard once before, that soft, almost reverent sound it had made when he had first freed it from the ropes. He swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what was happening. Then, just as silently as it had arrived, the lion turned and walked away, disappearing into the morning mist. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, standing there long after it was gone, his chest tight with something indescribable. The wild didn't offer explanations. It didn't promise understanding. But sometimes, just sometimes, it gave something greater, a connection that went beyond words, beyond species, beyond the rules of nature itself. And Jack knew, without a doubt, that this was not the last time their paths would cross. The story of Jack and the lion is more than just a tale of survival. It is a testament to the power of kindness, trust, and the unexpected bonds that can form between humans and nature. In a world where we often see ourselves as separate from the wild, this story reminds us that compassion transcends species and that even the most untamed creatures can recognize and return an act of goodwill. In 2025, as the world continues to grapple with environmental challenges, deforestation, and human-wildlife conflicts, this story serves as a powerful lesson in coexistence. It teaches us that when we respect and protect the natural world, it has a way of giving back in ways we least expect. Jack's experience with the lion demonstrates that true courage isn't just about facing danger, it's about making the choice to help, even when there is no expectation of reward. In today's fast-paced, self-centered society, this is a lesson that holds more value than ever. His unwavering decision to save a creature in need, without hesitation or fear, ultimately led to his own salvation. It reminds us that the kindness we show to others, whether human or animal, has a way of coming full circle. As we move through 2025, let this story be a call to action. Whether in conservation efforts, relationships, or daily interactions, we should strive to act with empathy and respect. Nature is not something to be conquered but something to be understood, cherished, and protected. The bond between Jack and the lion proves that in moments of crisis, connections, no matter how improbable, can change the course of our lives. In the end, what we give to the world is often what we receive in return. Jack's incredible journey with the lion is proof that kindness and courage can bridge even the wildest of boundaries. But what happens next? Should Jack continue to observe the lion from a distance, respecting the natural order, or should he take a more active role in understanding and studying this rare bond between man and beast? What lessons can he apply to his work as a ranger moving forward? We want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Do you believe animals can truly remember acts of kindness? What would you do if you were in Jack's position? Your insights and suggestions can help shape the next steps in his journey. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story of survival, connection, and the extraordinary relationships between humans and nature. Your support helps bring more incredible stories like this to life. Subscribe now and be part of the journey.